Hey everyone, and welcome. In this tutorial, we're going to look at scatter plots, and we're going to see how we can create a scatter plot. We're also going to learn how we can visualize our plots, and finally, we're going to look at how we can change the attributes of our scatter plots. So for example, changing the color of our data points, or also changing the markers that we use. Hey everyone! Okay, so let's get started with making our first plot with Matplotlib. So the first thing that we're going to need to do to be able to use Matplotlib is we're going to need to import it. So in our Python environment, we're going to type in import Matplotlib. So this allows us to import the Matplotlib package. And specifically, right now we want to use the Pipelet section of the Matplotlib. So we want to import matplotlib.pyplot. And since matplotlib.pyplot is quite a long name, we're going to abbreviate it in our code as PLT. So this is the kind of standard form of importing. And so we're importing the matplotlib.pyplot library, and we're going to import it as PLT so that when we want to reference the data later, or when we want to reference the matplotlib.pyplot, we only have to type in PLT rather than the whole matplotlib.pyplot. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing that we're going to need for plotting is we're actually going to need some data to plot. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create some linear kind of data. So we're just going to create numbers between -100 and 100. And we're just going to store these into lists for x and y data, and then we'll just plot them against each other. So we're going to create a variable x, which is going to be an empty list, and we're going to create a variable y, which is also going to be an empty list. And these are going to hold our x and our y data respectively. So to just kind of create our data, we're going to use a for in loop. So we're going to go for I, which is going to be our temporary variable. We're going to go in range, and we're going to start at -100, and we're going to go up to 101 because our upper limit, if we remember, is up to but not including. So if we stop our range at 101, that means the final number that we're actually going to get is going to be 100. And if we're not adding any other parameters here, that just means we'll go in steps of 1. Now what we're going to do inside this for loop is we're going to go into x, and we're just going to go in here and say append. And to x, we're just going to append I. And we're going to do the same thing for y. So in y, we're going to go y.append I, just like this. Now what this is going to give us, lists that are going to look like this. So if I just put a comment here, our x is eventually going to look like -100, -99, -98, and so on, and then we go all the way, and we got 99, and then 100. So that's how our x list is going to look like. And our y list is going to be very similar because we're just pretty much doing the same thing, but here to x and here to y. So we're also going to see -100, then -99, -98, and so on until we get up to 99 and 100. So we're going to have all the numbers between -100 to 100 in steps of 1. And this is how our x and y lists are going to look like. They're pretty much identical. They're just stored in 2 different variables, and this is just kind of for reference for us so that we know how we should plot it. Okay, so let's go ahead and make our first plot. Now our first plot is going to be a scatter plot. So how would we go about that? Well, what's really great with Matplotlib is that a lot of the kind of initiating figures and all that stuff is taken care of behind the scenes. So unless we want to make really intricate graphs, which we can look at later too, we don't actually need to start declaring figures and all that stuff. We just need to say what we want to plot. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with that. So what we want to do is we want to go into matplotlib.pyplot, and we can access it by just typing in PLT. And in matplotlib.pyplot, we want to access the scatter method. And so we're just going to open and close parentheses, and then we're going to play around with that a little bit. Now the first things that we're going to need to put in is we're going to need to put in our x variable that we want to plot and our y variable. So we're going to plot x versus y like this. So this is how we make a basic scatter plot of x versus y. Now, to indicate to Matplotlib that we're done creating this plot and we want to see it, we actually have to type in afterwards plt.show like this. And so what this does is that everything that we've created for this plot, we're now going to see. Now you can kind of think of it, so we're not that concerned yet of having to take care of the figure kind of in the backhand and stuff and manage that. But once we type pld.show, everything that we've kind of done above now gets put together into the graph, and we can see the graph on our screen. So if we run this, we're going to see, and we have this scatter plot created here. Now we can't really see that well if these are just individual points, or if this is just kind of a line connecting it. It's kind of hard to make out. We also aren't really sure about the axis sizes yet and stuff, but that's all stuff that we'll look at later. So let's just look at some of the properties, and maybe let's also reduce our step, or rather increase our step size so that we actually reduce the amount of data that we have here. And let's go in steps of 5. So now we're going to have -100, then we should have -95 and -90, and here we'll go from 95 to 100. So we're always going in steps of 5, and similarly we'll have that for the y data. So we can actually print out maybe our x data before, so our x and y data is going to look alike. Maybe we can just print them both out. And this is just to kind of reduce the amount of points that we'll see here. So if we run this again, yeah, now we see, so we've got our x data, which is here. We've got our y data, which is here, so they're identical, and that's just because we're doing the same thing with different variable names here. And we also see that when we plot it, now we don't have that much dense data, so we can actually see the individual points. Now we can also go ahead and edit how this scatter plot is kind of portrayed to us. So one thing that we can do, for example, is change the size of these circles. Now, the way that we can do that is by changing the characteristic s, and we can set this to a new value. Now, the default value that we see here is 20, so what we can do, for example, to make them smaller is set the size equal to 10. And if we run this, we see, compared to above here, that our circles have actually become a lot smaller. And we can also make it 15, for example, to have something in between these, or we can make it 5 to have it even smaller. It really depends on us. So if we have a lot of data, like we had in the very top here, then maybe it'd be nice to have smaller sizes so that we can actually distinguish the data. Here it wasn't that big of a deal because our data is already distinguishable, so our original plot, we can still distinguish the individual points. So we don't really need to reduce the size, but we can if we want to. So maybe let's just put this back at 15 just so that we can see it a little bit better. And let's run this again. So this is what we're looking at now. What we can also do is we can change the color. So for example, if we want the color to be red, we can say C, which is going to stand for color, so that's how we change the color. And here we can put in red, for example. So if we run this now, what we see is that our circles are now red rather than blue, which we had up here. We can also change it to green, for example. We can run it again. Now we have green. So you can really just change it however you like. So this is how we can set the color property. So what else can we do? Well, rather than having circles here, we can also put in kind of different symbols. And the way that we can do that is we can change the marker property. So I'm just going to put this on a new line just so that we can kind of see both things at the same time. So to change the marker, we can make it equal to, and then we want to put in here what we want our marker to be. Now there are many different things that we can set our marker up. I'll just show you a couple of examples. If you have anything specific in mind, you can also look it up on the Matplotlib website. They'll give you all the information of all the markers they have. They have dozens of them. I'll just show you a couple. So one thing that we can do, for example, is rather than having circles, we can have squares. And we get that by saying marker is equal to s. So if we do that, we see now we got squares instead of the circles that we had up here. Something else that we can do is use an asterisk symbol. And if we do this, this is going to give us stars, or it's going to give us these asterisk-like symbols. We can also make pluses by having a plus here, for example. And so now we're going to see a bunch of pluses here. Maybe we can make them a little bit bigger, 25, so that we can see them a little bit better. Maybe 45 or something, just to really get that definition. Alright, so that's how we kind of see the pluses. Then another thing we could do, for example, are triangles, and so that's going to be this kind of power 2 symbol, this kind of hat. And so this is going to give us triangles. So there's just a bunch of, different things that we can do. So the standard one is the O, which gives us the circles. So right now the circles are huge, so let's reduce the size back to 15. But yeah, so this is how we can kind of manipulate the markers too. Now, it may, not be that kind of necessary now, if we only have, one plot here, just because, well, we only have this one plot, so we don't really need to distinguish it. But if we add in a second scatter plot, for example, so you would ask, how would we go about that? Well, if we make a second y value, for example, so y is now going to be, or we'll have a y2 like this, which is going to be another empty list. And what we're going to do here in creating our data, we're going to do y2 dot append. And now what we're going to do here is our y2 is going to be 2 times I. So we've got our y value, which is just I, so that's what we see here, and our y2 data is going to be 2 times y. And now the reason that we're doing that is because we're going to add a second plot to our scatter plot. So we're going to add a second line. And so how we're going to do that is we're going to go, before we do plt.show, we're going to go here and go into matplotlib.pipelet, and we're going to access the scatter method again. And now we're going to plot x versus y2. And now maybe to just distinguish them, we'll set the color equal to red for y2, and we'll make the marker be a plus, like this. And so if we run our code now, what we're going to see is here we have our y2 data, which are the red pluses, and here we have our standard y data, which are the green circles. And so what's really cool is now we have different ways of distinguishing our data. So we are distinguishing in one sense through the red color and the green color, but we're also distinguishing through the plus markers and the circular markers. And what we also kind of learned is that we can create multiple plots within one figure here. And that's just, before we call this matplotlib.pipelet.show method, we actually just put in different types of plots. So we put in a scatter plot with x and y data, and then we create a second scatter plot with x and y2 data. And this gets all saved in the same figure, in the same plot, and then when we actually show our data, we see that everything is together in this plot, and we see it all as one. Yeah, so that's it for the basics of scatterplot. We'll look at also adjusting the limits here and adding figure labels, and all that stuff. We'll look at that later. This is just the basics of scatterplots, how we can take our data values and how we can plot them against each other, and how we can make basic scatter plots using Matplotlib. Alright, so let's recap what we just learned. We saw how we can create a scatter plot. We also saw how we can kind of plot two different types of data against each other in a scatter plot. We saw how we can visualize our plots, and we also saw how we can change the attributes of the scatter plots. So we saw how we can change the size of our data points, how we can change the color, and how we can change the marker from being circles to squares or pluses, for example.